深く世界の体制と帝国の現状とに鑑み、以上の措置をもって自局を収集せんと欲し、ここに終了なる汝親民に次ぐ秦は帝国政府をして米英四蘇四国に対しその共同宣言を受諾する旨通告せしめたり。
On August 6th and August 9th, 1945, atomic bombs were used for the first, and so far last time, in the history of warfare. The targets were the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within the blink of an eye, the lives of around 200,000 people, most of them civilians, were extinguished. Japan, after participating in World War II for 4 years, was defeated. On September 2nd, 1945, the USS Missouri arrived in Tokyo Bay, adorned with the flags of the US, Britain, Soviet Union, and China. Aboard the warship, at 9 a.m. Tokyo time, the Foreign Minister and General of the Armed Forces of Japan signed a document which made Japan's surrender official. After a few more signatures and a 20-minute ceremony, it was finally over. The most violent and costly war in the history of mankind has come to an end. 6 days later, General Douglas MacArthur arrives at the American embassy in Tokyo. The American flag is raised, and the 8th Army receives the order to both occupy and administer Japan, a country which was in ruins. Merely the historic city of Kyoto, which is considered to be the cultural capital of Japan, was largely unharmed. The actual capital of Japan, Tokyo, experienced quite the opposite. Out of 1,650,000 buildings in the city, 1 million were now destroyed, mainly during the fire raids in 1945. As grim as these numbers may sound though, Tokyo and with it Japan was ready to rise from its ashes. American businessman Edwin Pauley, in a letter to General MacArthur, claimed, "In spite of extensive destruction, especially in the closing phases of the war, Japan retains more industrial capacity than she needs or has ever used for her civilian economy." Japan was about to be rebuilt, and the US was tasked with the job. However, while carrying out said rebuild, the occupation government would inadvertently revive Japan's crime groups, also known as the Yakuza. For years, with Japan deeply involved in wars on multiple fronts, these gangs had to suffer through poverty and all other kinds of hardships. But just like Japan, the Yakuza would return to their former strength, and in the process would become bigger and more influential than they had ever been. This is the story of Japan under American occupation and the rebirth of the Yakuza. In order to rebuild the defeated nation of Japan, quite a few things had to be done. Japan's military was to be disarmed, with all their weapons, war equipment, and factories ordered to be disposed of. Also, hundreds of war criminals had to be put to trial, a lengthy process which culminated in a sort of Far Eastern version of the Nuremberg trials, also known as the Tokyo trials. The occupation was also put in charge of getting rid of secret societies and releasing political prisoners, while also completely revamping Japan's school system. More important than all of these things though, at least to the Americans, was to make sure that post-war Japan would adopt a democratic constitution. The last thing that the US was looking for was to see Japan turn communist, and they were ready to do everything in their power to prevent it from happening. While working around the clock on making all these things possible, the people of Japan were still starving. Sure, the war was over, which was a huge relief for people worldwide, including Japan. Relief, however, does not fill an empty stomach. The occupation supplied Japanese citizens with rations. However, these rations were kept at a minimum. This was not necessarily done out of spite for the citizens of America's fierce war rivals. In truth, rations were in short supply even for American allies. This shortage of rations brought with it some nasty negative side effects that would snowball into a way bigger problem. the black markets. Quickly and in huge numbers, these illegal trading places would offer the opportunity for the starving population to get some actual food and other items. The most popular item sold at these markets was of course rice, which was not only a rarity at the time, but also very expensive. The average salary post-war was estimated to be about 10 yen per day, which at the time was barely enough to buy one small orange. The earliest iterations of these illegal markets were not controlled by the Japanese though. Instead, the so-called Sangokujin took over Japan's market trade. Sangokujin translates to people of three countries, with the three countries representing China, Taiwan, and Korea. Citizens of these three nations which surround Japan were brought in during World War II in order to replace Japanese workers who had to join the army. To put it bluntly, they were basically being treated like slaves. Out of the 2.6 million Koreans and 50,000 Chinese citizens that were brought to Japan, 2 million were sent back home after the end of World War II, while the rest stayed and tried to make a living in a newly occupied post-war Japan. They were able to dominate the early post-war black markets, mainly because the occupiers, who also frequented these markets, did not trust Japanese market stall owners and decided to buy from Sangokujin instead. In addition to their dominance over the black markets, Japan's immigrant workers also had a lot of pent-up aggression towards Japanese citizens, which would sometimes result in violent attacks. While all of this was going on, Japanese police were not able to intervene. They were in pretty rough shape themselves. Apparently, too many ultra-nationalists and other people who could threaten the rebuild of Japan were employed as law enforcement before and during the war, which led to the dismantling of pretty much the entire police force. With nobody around to keep these attacks or even the black markets under control, groups of Japanese citizens who were enraged by the actions of the Sangokujin took matters into their own hands. The Yakuza were back. Meanwhile, in the port city of Kobe in Japan's Kansai region, something big was going down. In a frightening show of power, 300 Sangokujin held hostages inside a local police station. Taoka Kazuo, boss of the highly influential Yamaguchi-gumi gang, was there. According to him, the mayor of Kobe, with no police around to solve the problem, asked the Yakuza for help. The mayor should have been well aware that asking a Yakuza for a favor brings with it a huge debt. The gangs gathered all the weapons at their disposal and successfully fought back against the Sangokujin. Not only did it make them feel like heroes, but they were also able to hit two birds with one stone. The Sangokujin that the Yakuza despised so much were embarrassed, while the most powerful person in the city was now in their debt. Years after losing all their money and political connections due to the war, the star of the Yakuza was slowly beginning to rise again. Even in the public's eye, the Japanese Mafia started to gain popularity, with tales like the one from Kobe starting to spread all across Japan. One tale in particular might, even nowadays, bring back nostalgic feelings to the oldest generation of Japan: the Battle of Shimbashi. Shimbashi is an area in Tokyo which is about as central as it gets, being a 10-minute walk away from Ginza, which is now the city's shopping and entertainment hub. Obviously a very influential area to control, even during the 40s. According to the tale, some Yakuza salvaged a weapon from a destroyed fighter plane, set it up atop an elementary school building, and used it to force Taiwanese gangs in the area to retreat. The accuracy of this story is, at best, questionable, but it certainly worked in convincing many poor and frustrated citizens that the Yakuza were some kind of saviors of the Japanese people. While all of this crazy, violent stuff was going down, the occupation government was well aware of the problems. However, there's a big difference between being aware of a problem and understanding a problem. One of the rare cases of someone in the occupation government caring about what was really going on in Tokyo came in July of 1946. Harry Schuck, an investigator for the Public Safety Division, found out about a man named Matsuda Giichi, who was the founder and leader of the Kanto Matsusakaya Matsuda-gumi, or Matsuda-gumi for short. The leader of this gang was actually shot by one of his own members, which led to his wife taking over the business. Investigator Schuck brought her in for questioning, making her spill the beans regarding the history of the gang. Matsuda-gumi was founded just a year before, in 1945. The idea to form a gang came when they both noticed the meteoric rise of black markets in their area. Obviously, they wanted in on the money. The investigator was especially shocked to hear that Matsuda had the support of police in setting up his black markets, which made money by charging stall owners for basic needs like cleaning and electricity, and of course, licenses. Matsuda was basically without competition in Shimbashi until the Sangokujin came, which resulted in a fierce rivalry between the two factions. This exact origin story probably applies to every newly formed or revived gang in Japan at the time, in one form or another. The rise of the black markets allowed him to gain a foothold and influence in their area, resulting in the rebirth of the Japanese underworld. Among the hundreds, if not thousands of gangs that sprung up all across the country at the time, two bosses rose to the top of them all. Ando Akira was a man who, while his fellow countrymen were starving, managed to make millions in a destroyed and defeated country. However, his rise to immeasurable fortunes is a unique case, with Ando actually starting his rise to power during the war. He was the owner of Dayan Construction, which was tasked by none other than the Japanese government with moving around factories and establishing infrastructure in certain areas. Especially during the air raids, this was a crucial job, and a profitable one at that. Even more importantly, Ando controlled the Korean workforce of Japan. As you may remember, the number of Korean workers reached 2 million by the end of the war, making Ando a very influential person. The end of the war, however, did not spell the end of his profits. Quite the opposite, in fact. He was now employed by the Americans instead, with his work starting even before the occupation government set up shop in Tokyo. Atsugi Air Base, where General MacArthur landed before taking office as the occupation leader, was actually prettied up and prepared by Ando. Ando's influence on Yakuza gangs becomes clear when realizing that his company was actually a mix of a construction company and a gang. Even today, a lot of the most influential Yakuza families around run this exact model, and it has worked wonders for many bosses over the past few decades. Furthermore, Ando came to pull some strings regarding politics as well. He owned a few nightclubs that some of the American big dogs would frequent, which was of particular interest to all the politicians in Japan who wanted democracy and the existence of an emperor to stay in place. To the Americans, Ando appealed just as much, if not even more, by proudly proclaiming that he will fight communism as long as he lives. Certainly a phrase that would bring a joyful tear to the eye of every post-war American. Despite all this power, influence, and money, Ando preferred to stay out of the public eye though. So much so that I wasn't even able to find a photo of the guy. Ozu Kinosuke, on the other hand, was the complete opposite in this regard. In an October 1947 issue of the Saturday Evening Post, Darrell Kerrigan describes Ozu as Tokyo's own Al Capone. How did this guy become famous enough to make it into an American magazine? Ozu was an ordinary gangster like any other during the war. His rise to fame and power takes us back to Shimbashi and the death of Matsuda Giichi. Remember this guy? After his demise opened up an opportunity, Ozu reacted quickly and took over the Shimbashi area. But he wouldn't stop there. He also took control of both the gambling business and the gangs in Tokyo's Shinjuku area. Shinjuku, as many of you may know, is now the nightlife district of Japan's capital, and it all started around this time. With control over two of the most important areas in Tokyo, Ozu was big enough to receive a place in the Chamber of Commerce. Following this huge boost in influence, he even ran for a seat in parliament. Even though he lost to a communist opponent, he received an impressive 12,000 votes. One thing was clear, the Yakuza were not only back to making loads of money, their influence in Japanese politics was also about to return. While all of this was going on, occupation forces did not only ignore the rise of the Yakuza, they actively supported them, with GIs being some of the main suppliers of the black markets, which made the gangs so much money. To put into perspective how much power and control we are talking about here, some numbers might be necessary. In total, 48,000 market stalls were estimated to exist in Tokyo. Out of these 48,000 stalls, 88% were controlled by the tekiya, which are Yakuza-related peddlers. There was even a union for street stall tradesmen, called Roten Tokyo Kumiai, which also boasted some incredible numbers. 200 bosses controlling 4,000 members and 22,000 lower members. At the top of it all, Ozu Kinosuke, the Al Capone of Tokyo. Numbers regarding Yakuza groups were equally impressive, with Tokyo being the hotspot for gang activity. In the capital alone, 181 oyabun, or bosses, had control over 7,400 kobun, or lower-class gangsters. Similar numbers were also estimated to be present in the city of Kobe. Stunning numbers. Surely the report containing this and much more information would be of interest to General MacArthur and the occupation government. Apparently not, since the monthly reports never even made it to the general's desk. Except for a few people inside the occupation, nobody seemed to show any interest in stopping the rise of the criminal underworld in Japan. This may seem baffling, considering that their job was to rebuild Japan, and the thriving underworld sure doesn't sound like it would help such an endeavor. Even more so when you consider that a lot of the biggest Yakuza groups had strong links to ultranationalists. If you watched my previous video about the Dark Ocean Society, you also know that ultranationalist groups were in large part responsible for Japan's entry into World War II, which cost the US dearly. So, why accept the existence of not only the Yakuza, but also the ultranationalists? In order to understand this, we must also understand that the US certainly didn't take the job of rebuilding Japan out of sheer kindness. There was a lot at stake for the Americans. Simply put, their ultimate goal during the occupation was preventing Japan from turning communist. The ultranationalists were on the complete opposite side of communism, making them powerful allies in many ways. The relationship between Americans and the Yakuza became even more significant than merely ignoring the gangs. When the JCP, or Japanese Communist Party, increased its membership from 8,000 to 100,000 in just 3 years, the occupation seemingly panicked. A lot of their efforts to stop the JCP was done very publicly. This included raids of radio stations and newspaper agencies, and ordering universities to let go of professors that supported communism in any way. In total, around 20,000 workers lost their job during this purge. The dirty work, which had to be kept under covers, was outsourced to Yakuza gangs. One such job came in 1947, when Chinese citizens in Yokohama harassed the Japanese. Instead of taking care of it themselves, a newly founded gang was hired to take care of the problem, the Toseikai. Their leader, Machi Hisayuki, was of Korean-Japanese descent and deeply involved in rightist activities. Even then, during the early years of the group, their manpower and connections were enough to quickly take care of problems like this. The Toseikai, though, would only get bigger, and actually still exists to this day under the name Toakai. In September of 1951, the San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed and came into effect in April the following year. After an eventful 7-year period, the American occupation of Japan was officially over. Japan was independent once again. A constitution, the creation of which was overseen by General MacArthur, was put into place in 1947. Fun fact, Japan is the only country in the world which had its constitution written by another country. The Japanese constitution is also the oldest unamended constitution in the world. It has actually remained unchanged from its original 1947 version. Not for lack of trying, though. Japanese women in the 50s started applying for more and more jobs and finally got the right to vote. Speaking of which, elections were held regularly, as is usual for a democratic state, which Japan has now become. Japan was still Japan. In many ways, it has westernized, but in just as many ways, it has stayed true to its roots and traditions. This balance between looking toward the future while not forgetting one's roots is something that is still a fitting description for the Japan of today. In many ways, the foundation for that was laid during the occupation years. But while on the surface, Japan seemed to have headed full steam in the right direction, the country's criminal underground was about to experience the same meteoric rise as Japan's economy would, with one man in particular playing a huge role in making this rise to the top a reality. Tune in next time when we take a look at the life of Kodama Yoshio, the visionary godfather. Sayonara.